Hello, everyone. When a leader in nuclear power starts talking about historical lands, it isn't a flourish. It's a political upgrade. It turns a war from a dispute with terms into a mission with no finish line. That is why I want to speak to an American audience today. Because the temptation in Washington is simple. Treat Ukrainian territory as a bargaining chip, sign a deal, and move on. But if the Kremlin's framing is historical return, then a deal built on land for pause does not buy peace. It buys time for the next round. In mid-December 2025, Putin used this language in two settings. On December 17th, an expanded meeting of Russia's Defense Ministry Board, he said that if substantive dialogue fails, Russia would achieve the liberation of its historical lands by military means. 2 days later, on December 19th, at his year-end call-in show and press conference, he repeated the same idea in civilian packaging. Russia is open to peace, but only on terms that validate Russia's gains and Russia's narrative. Different audiences, one frame. This is the pivot from propaganda slogans to imperial intention. Here is the part one want Americans to hear clearly. This isn't only about Ukraine. It is about the rule that would be normalized if Ukraine is pushed into territorial concessions. If borders can be changed by force and then legalized by negotiation, then history becomes a weapon again. And Putin is not hiding that his preferred justification is historical. In plain language, it is a return to imperial logic, a former empire claiming a right to recollect what it treats as lost colonies or dependent zones. In U.S. domestic politics, a land concession can sound like a cold but realistic compromise. Freeze the front. Stop the bleeding. Focus elsewhere. Understand why that logic exists. But here is the problem. For Putin, territory is not just a negotiation item. He is framing it as entitlement. An entitlement cannot be satisfied in a clean, final way, because history has no natural boundary. If you legitimize the principle, you also legitimize the appetite. Putin has been sending a second message that fits perfectly into this strategy. The claim that Russia is acting carefully in Ukraine. On December 2nd, 2025, answering media questions, he said, Europe is not Ukraine, and that in Ukraine, Russia is acting surgically very carefully, adding that if Europe chose war, events would look completely different. This is not a battlefield report. It's coercive signaling. It tells Russian viewers, we control the tempo. And it tells Western viewers, don't assume today's level of violence is the ceiling. If you refuse our terms, we can raise the cost. Put those two lines together, historical lands plus we're being careful, and you get a bargaining mechanism. Create fear of a worse future to speed up concessions in the present. So why does the Kremlin need this mechanism now? Because time is the rarest resource in a long war. A high-intensity conflict drains manpower, equipment, money, and political attention. Russia has adapted, but adaptation is not comfort. Even Russian officials increasingly speak in the language of a war economy. And Russia's central bank keeps warning about inflation pressures and uncertainty while trying to keep the financial system stable. In that context, a pause is not simply a diplomatic preference. It is a strategic necessity. A pause allows stockpiles to be rebuilt, budgets to be reshuffled, recruitment pressure to be managed, and society to be kept under one simplified narrative. We're winning, we just need patience. This is where I want to be direct about President Trump's potential approach. If Trump treats Ukrainian territory as just a term of a deal, something you trade to end the war, he may succeed in producing a ceasefire on paper. But he will also confirm a bigger rule. Territorial conquest can become legal reality if you hold out long enough and intimidate the other side. That rule will not end the conflict. It will reshape it, because once Russia gets what it needs most, time, its incentives change. The Kremlin can declare victory domestically. It can repair parts of the war machine. It can reorganize forces. And it can return to pressure when conditions are favorable again. In other words, don't confuse a pause with peace. Now, let's talk about how the next round may look, because this is where many Americans underestimate the risk. People imagine one dramatic moment, a Russian tank column headed for Warsaw. If that doesn't happen, they assume the danger is over. That's not how coercion works. Pressure can shift from open war to technical instruments, transit choke points, trade restrictions, logistics disruptions, energy and infrastructure leverage, migration rules, sanctions retaliation, and targeted influence operations that narrow the room for maneuver of neighboring governments. A ceasefire can end artillery fire and still leave an entire region living under constant coercion. You could see Moscow normalizing that worldview in diplomacy. 2. In a mid-December interview, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov argued that Western countries are trying to split the Caspian Five format and then impose decisions in the region. Whether you accept that claim or not, the framing is important. Conflict is presented as formats, rules, and outside interference, not only as tanks. This is exactly how pressure is prepared for the post-ceasefire stage. Now, the Alaska line. Let me be precise. I'm not predicting that Russia will invade Alaska. I am not claiming an imminent plan. Alaska is a stress test, a way to show Americans what happens when history is accepted as a license for force. If you normalize historical lands as a justification for territorial change, you normalize a world where every major power can open archives and claim that older maps trump modern treaties. It doesn't matter whether Alaska is realistic as a target. What matters is that the principle makes even the question thinkable. Once history replaces law, the boundary of the thinkable keeps moving. That is how the international system breaks. Not in one dramatic leap, but by slowly replacing law with narrative and then backing narrative with weapons. Europe has its own mirrors of this logic. Kaliningrad is Russian today, but historically it sits on layers of European memory linked to Königsberg and East Prussia. The point is not that anyone should claim it back. The point is that historical logic is always reciprocal. If history is a weapon, everyone can pick it up. So the real warning to Washington is not Russia will take Alaska. The real warning is, if the United States helps normalize the principle that conquest can be blessed by diplomacy, then the global system becomes a marketplace of historical claims. One more layer, and it matters. Ending a major war is not only a foreign policy decision. It is a domestic shock. It is demobilization. It is large numbers of veterans returning to civilian life. It is trauma, resentment, and hard questions. Who paid the price? Who benefited? What was it all for? In some systems, war is politically easier than peace. War creates discipline. War simplifies the narrative. War justifies repression and hardship. Peace forces accountability and social repair. So when Putin shifts from security slogans toward historical lands, he is not only speaking to foreigners. He is also creating an internal mission with no deadline. A mission that can justify continuing mobilization, continuing control, and continuing sacrifice, even when society is tired. That is why a territorial deal is so dangerous. It would not close the story. It would validate the story. And if you validate the story, you should expect sequels. The bottom line is simple. If Moscow's frame is historical return, then territorial concessions are not a final settlement. They are an installment. They create a precedent, and precedents create appetite. If Moscow's strategic need is a pause, then a deal that delivers a pause will be treated as a tool, not as an end. So to anyone in Washington thinking about a quick fix, don't build policy on the hope that land concessions buy lasting peace. Build policy on the reality that they buy time. And time, in this logic, is preparation. Thanks for watching. If this kind of analysis helps you see the structure behind the headlines, support the channel with a like and a subscription. It helps this video reach people who are trying to understand the real stakes.